Welcome to the Calm Analytics channel. This is Boris Dizenghausen with you. Today is May 18th. Here are the main news stories at this moment. Well, let's start with the volcano in the Moscow region. Take a look. This is still the Solnekhnogorsk oil terminal burning, which was attacked by drones yesterday in the village of Durykino, Moscow region. You know, since yesterday, thousands, maybe tens of thousands of comments and videos from residents of Moscow and the Moscow region have appeared online about how scared they are, how they've started having panic attacks. What are we supposed to do with this horror now? Where is it safer to be when drones attack, at home or outside? Some are even calling to end the war. Can you imagine? It turns out that the war on television is very different from the one that can now be seen and heard from their Moscow apartments. And here's another interesting point. Russians from other regions couldn't care less about this. Some of them are even happy about the strikes on Moscow. It's paradoxical, but for them, Moscow is like a separate state that acts like a vacuum cleaner, sucking money out of all the other regions. So, for example, in Perm, there isn't much sadness about the strikes on Moscow. And now Muscovites have started receiving instructions on what to do during drone attacks and how to pack an emergency bag. Let me repeat, it's only going to get worse. By the way, I've already started receiving information that some Moscow residents are preparing to leave the capital and move to regions they consider safer. Well, considering the increased range of Ukrainian drones, there will soon be practically no such regions left in Russia. I recommend Siberia. At least you'll start developing your vast territories. Maybe then you'll lose the desire to seize other people's lands. By the way, friends, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. You can do it right now. It's important for the channel's growth. Here, we're fighting against Putin's propaganda. Let's do it together. And let me remind you, everyone who subscribes to this channel will have soft and silky hair. By the way, Russian mass media somehow ignored the attack on Moscow. Apparently, the talking points from the Kremlin didn't arrive in time. And so, on Vesti Nedeli on Russia 1, the propagandist Kiselyov dedicated only about 30 seconds to the story about the drone attack and didn't even show any footage of the aftermath. Just like I showed you the volcano, but he didn't show anything. Channel 1, in its Sunday broadcast, didn't mention the attack at all. They completely ignored it. Apparently, an attack on Moscow isn't considered such an important event. By the way, let me add another piece of news to the anxiety of Russians. The first Ukrainian guided, or rather adjustable aerial bomb is ready for combat use. The warhead weighs 250 kilograms. Take a look at this video. According to the Ukrainian Minister of Defense, the development of the Ukrainian guided aerial bomb took about 17 months, and the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine has already purchased the first experimental batch. So this means that in the near future, Ukrainian guided bombs will begin targeting the Russian Federation's army. What is especially important here is that we are talking about the creation of Ukraine's own counterpart to high-precision glide bombs, which Russia, unfortunately, has been using en masse against Ukrainian cities and our positions. But now this tool will start to appear in Ukraine's arsenal. The main advantages of these bombs are their range and precision. In fact, Ukraine is gradually building its own line of precision weapons, long-range drones, naval drones, underwater drones, missile developments, and now its own guided bombs as well. And this is very bad news for Russian logistics and rear facilities, because if previously guided bombs were almost exclusively monopolized by the Russian Federation on the front, now the situation is beginning to change dramatically. The appearance of Ukrainian guided bombs means that not only border facilities will be under threat, but also the echeloned positions of the Russian Federation's army in the rear. In other words, essentially, the Ukrainian guided bomb is now changing the logic of the threat to the Russian rear. Up until now, strikes on Russian targets in the rear have been carried out by drones. But a glide bomb is a completely different threat profile. It means high speed, 250 kilograms of explosives, and accuracy within a few meters. So get ready, Russia. In every episode I say, get ready, and it will only get worse. Meanwhile, Ukraine and Ukrainians are showing the whole world that you can fight the enemy, even if he vastly outnumbers you in manpower and equipment. In every episode, we have an important fundraiser for the defense forces of Ukraine. Today, we are continuing to raise funds for drones and charging stations for the 37th Marine Brigade, for our Marines who are defending the Donetsk direction. The soldiers have recorded a video message for you. Please take a look.
Мене звати тату Аня. Я громадянка Бельгія. Я служу у складу 37-ї бригади морської піхоти. Звертаюся до Борис Озен та його підписників.
Ми є військовослужбовцями 37-ї окремої бригади морської піхоти зенітно-ракетно-артилерійського дивізіону. Наразі маємо потребу у зенітних дронах у кількості 100 одиниць. Просимо про допомогу у Бориса Тізенхаузена.
Слава Україні!
Героям слава!
The video features Anna. She is Belgian. When the war in Ukraine began, she came here. At first, she was a volunteer, but now she serves in the 37th Marine Brigade as a UAV operator. Despite the fact that Anna is missing a leg and uses a prosthesis, she shows the whole world every time how one can and should overcome difficulties. Let's help our Marines. Let's help Anna. The link to the fundraiser is in the description of this video. There are options for mono, private, and PayPal for those who want to help from abroad. If you're watching on another channel, there's always a QR code in the corner, which also leads to the fundraiser. In every episode, I want to thank you personally, both from myself and from the hundreds of our soldiers whom you have already helped. Remember, together we are a great force. I'd also like to draw your attention to another important detail. Ukraine attacked Moscow and the Moscow region right before Putin's visit to China. So I would pay attention to this sequence of events. A massive drone strike broke through 3 layers of air defense and paralyzed the Moscow airport precisely at the moment when Putin was supposed to demonstrate strength to Beijing right before his visit. He was supposed to secure new guarantees and tell them that everything was going according to plan. Do you understand how significant the timing was for this mirrored, let me remind you, strike on Moscow? Putin will come to Xi Jinping and tell him that everything is going according to plan, that by autumn they'll take Donbas, and Xi will reply, but you already have drones flying over Moscow, you Botoxed fool, what exactly is going according to plan, and where? Meanwhile, Putin, in his classic terrorist fashion, is striking residential areas in Ukraine. A strike was carried out on Dnipro. There are already 18 people injured as a result of the night attack. Among them are a 2-year-old girl and a 10-year-old boy. Odesa was also hit last night. Stay strong, Dnipro. Stay strong, Odesa. Stay strong, all of Ukraine. I wish a speedy recovery to everyone who was injured. The mangy rat is furious. Powerless rage and anger are boiling over. Notice that almost no news is coming from the Russians at the front anymore. I'll tell you more. After every strike on Moscow or major Russian cities or ports, for example, the news that Russians have captured a Ukrainian village with 3 residents, which is now nothing but ruins, that kind of news will only irritate Russians. Why would they care about a pile of charred bricks hundreds of kilometers away when now drones can fly right into their windows? Tell me, why do these Muscovites, whose hands are shaking and who don't know where to run, need a Ukrainian village that's been leveled to the ground? Do they need it at all? Meanwhile, Ukraine has begun gradually reclaiming its territories. Today, the main intelligence directorate announced the liberation of Stepnohersk. This is in the Zaporizhia direction. As a result of the fighting, the Russians were driven out of fortified positions and key locations in Stepnohersk came under Ukrainian control. In other words, Russia is not only failing to occupy new territory, it's also losing the territories it had already occupied. By the way, people in the occupied territories are getting nervous, especially as news like this keeps coming in from there. The so-called head of the occupied Skadovsk district of Kherson region, appointed by the Russian Federation, Alexander Dudko, was wounded after a drone attack, according to Gauleiter Saldo. He was hospitalized with a shrapnel wound to the head and a blast injury. Saldo, by the way, has narrowly escaped a couple of times, almost miraculously, but I think that's only temporary. There's a real hunt going on for the occupiers there. So Dudko got his drone, and Saldo is still hiding somewhere in basements, but I don't think he has much time left either. The occupiers definitely can't win this squid game with Ukrainian drones. And now Putin's people have tried to explain why they aren't using nuclear weapons against Ukraine in response to strikes on Moscow, Chuaps, Perm, Ust-Luga, and so on. There's this propagandist Pavel Zarubin, who regularly gets some kind of comments from Putin. So they unleashed the Kraken on him, meaning they sent Peskov out to explain why nuclear weapons aren't being used. So Zarubin asks the question. People are wondering, well, we have these powerful bombs, so does that mean a nuclear power can just be nibbled at, can be bitten? And as always, Peskov started evasively talking about deterrence and cornerstones. Let's quote him. You cannot threaten a nuclear power. You cannot threaten its existence. This is what allows us to be confident in this. And this is the foundation of nuclear deterrence. Nuclear deterrence is an integral part and the cornerstone of our national security as a whole, Peskov stated. Naturally, it was necessary to let off some steam. After the strikes on Moscow, the ultra-patriots started shrieking. Where is our air defense? Where are our nukes? So they sent out the mustachioed PR flack to explain things. But here a very interesting situation arises. Peskov said that Russia could use nuclear weapons if there is a threat to the existence of the Russian Federation. But that threat already exists. And this 1.5 meter tall Botox threat is sitting right in the Kremlin. After all, it is Putin himself who, with this senseless war, has put the very existence of the Russian Federation at risk. So, Russians, you know exactly where you need to strike to put an end to all this. And then you won't even need nukes. Just one good hit with a snuff box to your throat cutter, and that's it. And everything will go back to the way it was before. By the way, have you noticed how the phrase, the second army in the world, has disappeared from everyday use? Seriously, no one says that anymore. Not even Russians. I wonder what happened. And do you also remember how some Russians used to laugh about Ukraine letting Putin hold a parade? Like, how could that be? We'll hold it ourselves. What can you even do? Well, the events in Moscow and the Moscow region not only showed, but actually proved this fact. I probably won't be wrong if I say that after such a success, when the air defense rings of Moscow and the Moscow region were breached, now millions of people living in Moscow will regularly hear and feel this war, which has returned exactly to where it started. Add to this Ukraine's constant increase in strike capabilities. In other words, the number of drones flying toward Moscow will keep increasing, constantly. Naturally, no one will forget about the other regions of the Russian Federation either, so that no one feels left out. Everything that allows Putin to replenish the war budget will burn. And as for the question of why it was allowed to happen, let me remind you that more than 200 of our defenders have already returned home as part of the 1,000 for 1,000 exchange. So there was a reason. Coming to Ukraine to destroy Ukrainians and our cities was Putin's fatal mistake. As they say, remember this post. I think many Russians will soon realize this. Well, last night, the Russians attacked a vessel with a Chinese crew in Ukrainian territorial waters. According to the spokesperson for the Ukrainian Navy, Dmytro Pletenchuk, the strike occurred precisely at the moment when the vessel was preparing to depart for China. There were no casualties, but the very fact is extremely telling. This is especially significant in light of Putin's upcoming visit to Beijing. Let me remind you, he is supposed to be there on May 19th. So, in other words, he's heading there right away with a load of unpleasant news. Well, first of all, I hit, as you put it, a ship with a Chinese crew. Secondly, Ukrainian drones struck Moscow. Ukraine is even producing its own now, by the way. And in general, everything is fine, and I'll capture Donbass by autumn. So that's basically how it is. But I don't know, maybe the clumsy Russian operators just didn't figure it out and hit a Chinese cargo ship. Well, we'll see. And one more piece of news. Military exercises involving the use of nuclear weapons have begun in Belarus. This was reported by the Ministry of Defense of the Republic of Belarus. The exercises are being conducted in cooperation with the Russian Federation, of course, and involve missile troops and aviation units of the Belarusian army. The plan is to practice the delivery of nuclear warheads and their preparation for use. Let me just remind you that at one time the Russian Federation apparently deployed nuclear weapons on the territory of the Republic of Belarus and is fully responsible for their use. Well, it's clear that this is just another round of old man games between Lukashenko and Putin. Recently, in Russia, there was outrage that the West was not frightened and did not react in any way to Putin's stories about the Sarmat missile tests. In general, the reaction to this was rather sluggish. The news just went unnoticed, because the more often you play the nuclear intimidation card, the less effective it becomes each time. That's why the balding centipede has already worn everyone out with his nuclear threats. Apparently, Putin and Lukashenko decided to perform as a pair, thinking that a threat from two senile old men would be stronger. I think there will be even less attention paid to this. And here's an interesting detail. I've noticed that Lukashenko, as a rule, whenever something like this happens, nuclear exercises or something else for which he could get flack on those days, on his channel, or rather on the channel where information about him is published, he puts out the most neutral content possible. He meets someone somewhere, goes to a village, digs up some potatoes, chops some wood, or does something else. He tries to come across as an ordinary country guy as much as possible. So I thought, let me see what Lukashenko is up to at the moment when the nuclear exercises are actually taking place. So I went to check what they're writing, and indeed, he's using the most generic routine phrases. He met there with a Russian governor. And here's a quote from Lukashenko. I think we need to focus on our own. These so-called sanctions have shown us that we need to rely on ourselves, engage in import substitution, and pursue other directions in order to create our own. Lukashenko is truly a master of these kinds of useless and meaningless phrases. Something like, the main concern is for the people, for Belarusians. That's what we should always remember. The people gave us power so that we could represent our people. He constantly comes up with things like this. You see, he keeps rambling on like a Soviet radio receiver, saying that everything is wonderful, great, that a bright future lies ahead, and that everything will be even better. And here is his latest brilliant statement from yesterday, in the same style. This is an absolutely real statement by Lukashenko. Without equipping the troops with modern weaponry, it is impossible to solve the task of defense. We must have the weapons that we can use, that we know how to handle, and those we can't handle we shouldn't have. What is he even talking about all the time? You could write these kinds of texts by the wagon load. We should eat the food that we can eat. Or we should speak the language that we are able to speak. A genius of thought. The great tuber constantly amazes with his deep statements. But the main thing is that in this spectacle with the nuclear exercises, Lukashenko is just a mere extra. Any Russian nuclear weapons deployed on the territory of Belarus remain under the strict control of Moscow. If Belarusian officials say something like a nuclear threat, even though they don't, but they hint at it, they do so exclusively on Putin's orders. So the feeble attempts to threaten from Belarus are, in essence, just another Putin trick, trying for the 100th time to scare everyone. Remember the program Good Night, Little Ones, or for a Western audience it would be more understandable to say The Muppet Show. So, Lukashenko is a puppet sitting on Putin's hand in every sense, pretending to say something on his own. I decided to check how Russia's chief propagandist, Solovyov, is commenting on the strikes on Moscow. Do you know what this jerk came up with? Pardon my French. That everyone in Moscow who got scared or is outraged or says it's time to end the war are all a vile liberal stratum and cowards. But real Russians, they take up arms and go to the front. He just forgot to mention that if they stop the payments, there won't be a single Russian left at the war tomorrow. And when asked why drones are flying into Moscow, Solovyov said that's none of your business, that Putin will decide how to respond when he sees fit. That's exactly what he said. So he's saying that Putin will definitely respond. But you, Russians, are not going to be let in on the plans. By the way, in the comments, Russians are asking Solovyov a lot of questions. Why have they been hearing the same thing from Solovyov for 5 years now? How much longer will Russia keep fighting just to occupy even Donbas? And why is it only getting worse? There you go. Interesting? Well, Solovyov doesn't answer questions like that. The margin of safety for Russian builders and developers is almost exhausted. This was stated by the Deputy Prime Minister of the Russian Federation, Marat Kusnulin. And who gave them permission to say that? I see once again Russian officials are telling half-truths, but very unpleasant ones. Who allowed them to say that the builders' margin of safety has been exhausted? The industry has already used up the resilience it had since 2024? Really? Now Putin will flip through some pretty slides? Now Putin will give an order and everything will be fixed. It's amazing, by the way, how Putin still hasn't signed a decree stating that the Russian economy must become the strongest and most powerful in a month. Well, and if that doesn't help, then Russians will have their internet completely shut off, leaving just one newspaper and television channel in Russia. And from morning till night, Solovyov will be on there saying that everything is going according to plan. Take care of yourselves, take care of your loved ones, subscribe to this channel, don't forget. And I ask you, let's help our Marines from the 37th Brigade. The link to the fundraiser is in the description of this video. Our help is extremely necessary for them right now. Have a peaceful day, everyone, and glory to Ukraine.